as is our custom, we start with a prayer in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, in addition to being a major philosophical and theological figure in the church, also was a theologian of the Eucharist. And the church this year is emphasizing Eucharistic spirituality. And I thought I would read a passage on his reflection on the Eucharist. The usefulness of the Blessed Sacrament is great and universal. It is great because it produces spiritual life within us now and will later produce eternal life. Since this is the sacrament of the Lord's Passion, it contains in itself Christ who suffered. Thus, whatever is an effect of our Lord's Passion is also an effect of this sacrament. Hence, it is clear that the destruction of death, which Christ accomplished by his death, and the restoration of life, which he accomplished by his resurrection, are effects of this sacrament. The usefulness of this sacrament is universal because the life it gives is not only the life of one person, but the life of the entire world. And for this, the death of Christ is fully sufficient. He is the offering for our sins, not for ours only, but also for those of the entire world. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, you will recall just getting a running start into, that will go back on, by the way, if I see anyone sleeping, the air conditioning. But you will recall that the major theme of the program this summer is confronting, as Paul did at Athens in Class 1, the dominant consensus of our time, which I characterize as a materialism. That there's nothing outside this universe. Science has demonstrated that, apparently. And just as Paul had to confront the people of Athens who were philosophical Greeks and pagan and move them to Jesus Christ, so too in our time we should confront head-on the materialism, naturalism that pervades our culture, that's taught in schools, that young people are living out of. We talked about statistical data just on the percent of young people who don't even believe God exists, or that there are any transcendental objective values. The number of people who no longer attend church, and so on. And the dominant narratives in our time are that you don't need to look outside the universe for meaning. Interesting Eastern notions of karma continue to gain popularity, and the universe, has blessed you kinds of commentary. No need to look outside. In fact, that's a sign of weakness if you do. Just appealing to religion as a crutch. And so we're taking this directly on in our program. And in particular, classes 2 through 4 will deal with this. Tonight, we're building on how we ended Class 1 with not the conflict of philosophy and science or metaphysics and science, but in fact their harmony. And that science without philosophy actually can't give an account of itself, isn't rational. So let's jump in. What we will cover today is modern science's challenge to philosophy today. Why is philosophy today kind of regarded like English literature? Academically speaking, kind of nice to hear the history of ideas, but it has nothing really definitive to tell us. It's just a matter of what people wrote. Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, and so on. It's nice, and if you learn Latin and Greek, you're useful traveling in Europe, but that's about it. But we will go back to the Greeks again. Aristotle and Aquinas interpreting him. Something happened somewhere around in the 17th century where the divorce of science and philosophy occurs with Descartes, Newton, and others. And we'll talk briefly about that. I'm then going to take you through a fundamental piece of philosophical content that has huge implications in theology. The notion of substance and causality. You recall we made brief references to how this is used in theology. We say consubstantial with the Father in the Creed, comparing Christ to God as Father. He's the same nature, same substance. Or in the Eucharist that we were just reflecting on, what's the theological term that's used? Transubstantiation. The real presence of Christ in the Eucharist after the manner of a substance. Good heavens, where do these terms come from? These terms are not only useful for theology, they are useful in exposing the gaps in the natural sciences, which ignores metaphysics and philosophy. If we have time, we'll get to the quantum mechanics aspects of this, which is quite revelatory of Aristotle, which Werner Heisenberg, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics in the 20th century, noted. Because his father actually taught the classics at the local university. And so young Werner had some exposure to Aristotle. If we have time, we will get to that. And then consequences for today. So a lot to cover. If something is unclear, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of plow through, hopefully in an entertaining way as well. But this content is heavy because it's important and because it's fundamental. It'll sound unnatural to you, but it's actually the basis of philosophical ethics, theological ethics in many ways. The theology of the church rests a lot on Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy of nature that he took from Aristotle and refashioned. Let's start with Stephen Hawking. If you doubt that physics has consumed, absorbed philosophy and theology as the science by which we get true knowledge about the world and anything else, here's this quotation that I'd like to read to you from Stephen Hawking, the noted theoretical physicist who won a Nobel Prize, passed away not too long ago. And this is from one of his last works, The Grand Design. What is the nature of reality? Where did this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. And this was written in 2014. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics, which is true in many ways. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Boom. He continues, ignorance of nature's ways led people in ancient times to invent gods, to lord it over every aspect of human life, since the connection of cause and effect in nature was invisible to their eyes. These gods appear inscrutable and people at their mercy. But with Thales of Miletus, about 2,600 years ago, that began to change. The idea arose that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered. And so began the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of gods with the concept of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday read. End quote. There you have it. And this is broadly taught in every major university in our country. It's kind of the implicit default setting. And as I mentioned to you last class, in the Pew polling and Discovery Institute polling, the number one reason why people aged between 18 and 29 either respond as an atheist or an agnostic is that science has explained the universe, its origin. There's no need to appeal to a creator God. And that group, that percent, continues to increase each and every year. And so here at Summer School of Faith, we're going to respond to all this and show the gaps in what I'll call the naturalism or mechanism alone in the sciences without philosophical foundations. In another way, the lack of a belief in God at some minimal level, also think of how our culture now, particularly among young people, is about being noticed in social media and other places, just to be noticed, even over the most silly and trivial things. In some ways, is a way of compensating for what all believers have almost unconsciously, which is, I'm always noticed, I'm always loved, I'm never alone. Imagine not having that belief. Imagine thinking this is all there is and no one notices me. There will be this compensation routine, especially among young people, to be noticed. Whether it's posting all the pictures over whatever they're posting, whether it's the number of tattoos per square foot on your body or the bolts in your eyebrows, whatever it is, I want to be noticed. And it's a compensation for a lack of a belief in the existence of God who watches over all of us at all times. So, let's begin. What we'll go through is what you would maybe get in a second or third year program in philosophy or in a philosophy of science course, which studies the methods of science, because they can be studied and evaluated. So what is metaphysics? Well, meta means after physics. And so the editor of Aristotle's texts, when they finished the first 8 books of the physics, there seemed to be a natural pause. And he wrote at the next page, metaphysics, metaphysis, after physics. There's nothing mystical about it. There's nothing science fiction about it. It's simply a more rigorous method in philosophy to study what is the fundamental structure of all that is. What is the fundamental structure of reality? Because the physics dealt with, as I have here later, being, material being in motion or change. But one step back is science for the first, say, 2,500 years of human existence was continuous with philosophy and theology. There was no separation we have today, no separation of church and state, no separation of philosophy and science. They were the same thing, just under different aspects. So Aquinas, in his work, The Division and Methods of Sciences, breaks down the sciences based upon their level of abstraction. So physics, or I should say natural philosophy, which was the same thing as physics, studies being in motion. If you open up a modern physics textbook today, it'll say the same thing. And it will study mechanics, which is beings, material beings, in motion. Whether it's pulling something with a frictional force, or angular momentum, rotating a bucket, or whatever it is, it's material beings in motion. That's the first level of abstraction that Aquinas identifies. The next one is mathematics, which studies things that are material but under the lens of quantification. Whether a triangle is orange or blue or made out of wood is irrelevant to the geometry of it. Whether you have 3 gallons plus 6 gallons equals 9 gallons, the math and the law of addition doesn't care if it's gallons or apples or backpacks or dollars. Math is about the quantification of material being. But you see, there's another level of abstraction, which is simply the consideration of being as such. What are the principles of being, whether it's material or not? We're not going to prejudge that, because there's no reason to. What are those principles abstracted from matter and quantification? Because quantification of mathematics is a property of matter. But we can even abstract from that, and that's what metaphysics is studying. The full range of what reason can know. So, what is the role of metaphysics vis-a-vis the natural sciences? First, it establishes the principles and logic by which the sciences operate, that they themselves do not demonstrate. It determines the scope of what the natural sciences can know, as we just saw, material being in motion. Physics, chemistry, biology is determined by its method, and it casts a net into the ocean. And if the net, let's say, has 3 inches spaces in the netting, it won't catch anything that's under 3 inches. It slips through its net. This is the methods of the sciences. They all have a particular method. Therefore, physics, and you'll see this all the time on YouTube or television shows of physicists talking about God or talking about ethics even. You'll have physicists talking about free will. Is there a soul? And you see this is beyond their method to speak, but a la Stephen Hawking, they're talking about it. And they're talking to the younger generation about it and have been doing so for the last 40, 50 years, if not longer. As we'll see, actually, modern physics actually is highly provocative and suggestive of metaphysics and intelligence outside of nature. As we touched on in the Q&A in Class 1, there is a method to the natural sciences. Typically in the form of a hypothesis is constructed, usually based upon some observables seen in nature. I picked a silly example here. The drug Trulicity reduces blood sugar. As pharmaceutical companies are prone to do, they'll invest hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in drug trials, have a control group and a test group, and compare and filter out anomalies, make sure they're comparing 60-year-olds to 60-year-olds, and so on. And the hypothesis is determined by the results of the trial, the data, an empirical result of this method of determining, is the hypothesis true? We briefly alluded to Albert Einstein. A lot of his theories weren't validated till Sir Arthur Eddington's photographs that showed conclusively that heavy objects like the sun, or the moon I should say, can bend light from the sun. And he accurately predicted the angle of refraction between its apparent position in the sky and its actual position. Validated his theory. So there's always an empirical content of some kind or another that justifies and validates a hypothesis in the natural sciences. And therefore, through induction, which is a conclusion from a finite sample to a general law. We'll talk about that move in a moment. But that's the scientific method in a nutshell. And there are other aspects to it that needn't take up our time. So scientism, which has been creeping along, certainly for several centuries, is basically a materialist ideology that claims that all knowledge to be true, valid, must take the form of empirical, physical, mathematical description. Only. That's kind of the assumption, often always implicit, sometimes explicit, in this movement of naturalism, sometimes called mechanistic, but it's prevalent in our culture. Interestingly, the sciences, which metaphysics in the critique of this kind of naturalism would say, well, there are certain principles not demonstrated by the natural sciences that they make use of, such as the principle of non-contradiction. We can't be in this room and not in this room at the same time in the same respect. That's a contradiction. So the principle of contradiction says the apple is red or it's not red. It can't be both at the same time in the same respect. Induction, making inferences from specific data to a general conclusion. What's that based on, by the way? It's based on the claim of the uniformity of nature, that what was the way things operated in the past is how they will operate in the future. Nature is uniform. I wish my mutual funds followed this pattern. But this assumption about the uniformity of nature is the basis for induction. That's why we take a finite sample and make a general conclusion from it, because we feel that finite sample taken in the past will have legs and predictive in the future. But that's based upon the uniformity of nature. Well, we think nature is uniform because we have inductively seen that things that have happened in the past will also happen the same way in the future. Water will freeze at 32 degrees, as we've seen in the past, and in the future. So induction is based upon the uniformity of nature, and the uniformity of nature is based on induction, inductive reasoning. You see how that's circular? But it's just assumed by physicists, chemists, biologists. And we would all agree with that assumption. But no experiment would demonstrate that, would it? Because the experiment would assume induction and the uniformity of nature to make its claim. So far, so good? So right away, things are not so peaceful in the world of the natural sciences in terms of them giving an account of their foundations. Scientism, as I mentioned, assumes this exclusive standard of knowledge that its method can't demonstrate. What lab experiment or telescope demonstrates that all there is empirical data to be known? You see how circular that is? It's a bit like the biblical fundamentalists saying God exists because the Bible says so. Well, but the Bible assumes God exists, and so too, when you look at the sky in a telescope and say that's all there is, that's not a scientific statement. That's just your maybe hope or desire. There's nothing in an empirical experiment that says I'm all there is. That's nonsense. That's a metaphysical claim. That's a philosophical claim. That's not a scientific claim. So as I mentioned here, these propositions of the regularity of nature, the uniformity of nature, the laws of induction and deduction for that matter, the principle of non-contradiction, metaphysics and logic are happy to supply to the natural sciences. We're in harmony. But the junior member, namely physics, to metaphysics, which is the senior member, the junior member is like the prodigal son who just runs off on its own. And as a result, it becomes incoherent on the big questions that it is coming across. So we'll hopefully delve into that more tonight, but we certainly will in Class 3. So that's the critique of scientism or naturalism or atheistic physics, that it's not scientific enough. Metaphysics exposes the limits of the scientific method as practiced by theoretical physicists and academicians. So we go back to the Greeks, and this is probably some of the best philosophical analysis in the history of philosophy, because Aristotle solved perennial questions that actually come up today in physics. If you think about, and I'll try to reduce this as best I can before jumping into this, but what Aristotle was trying to do is how do we account for change in nature, which is the same thing chapter 1 in any modern physics book, textbook, starts with 2. So far, so good. But he was combating two extreme positions in his time, one from Parmenides, a Greek philosopher, and another Heraclitus. Parmenides thought that change that we see every day in nature is an illusion because being already exists. And so being can't change into being because being already exists. And we can't get non-being, we can't get being from non-being because that's a river you can't cross. Hot soup doesn't become hot by itself. It needs an outside heat source. You can't get the being of hotness in a soup from a cold soup. So that was Parmenides' position. Heraclitus was the other extreme, and you could put in this camp Democritus, who was an atomist, that fundamental reality consists of atoms, which in Greek means what you can't cut. It's indivisible. But Heraclitus was famous for you can't step into the same river twice. All is flux. Whatever things are there are in constant motion, so there's nothing persistent about them. Another way to think about this is the pre-Socratics fall really into two categories. People, stuff or things. The people who are the stuff philosophers were people like Thales, who thought everything was water, some form of water. Or another name that you'll mention at your cocktail parties this summer, Empedocles, thought there were 3 or 4 core substances to all of reality: earth, water, fire, air. So they're the stuff people. The things people, Heraclitus and Democritus are the things people, because they did agree that there were natures, but they're in flux. Parmenides is the stuff guy. So at Thanksgiving, you have mashed potatoes, perhaps, and peas. Mashed potatoes are stuff. You know, how many mashed potatoes do you want? Well, you say, just give me a hunk of it, please. You know. Peas, you can count peas. So keep in mind these two ideas of what is the core of reality reappear in modern physics. Stuff, mashed potatoes, and peas, things that I can count. Parmenides is stuff, along with, one substance is what he basically concluded is the basis for everything that gives the illusion of change. Or Thales, water is the basis for everything, because everything that ultimately is heated becomes a liquid for Thales. He actually lived near a smelting facility, and he saw what high temperatures would do to iron, and concluded everything's a liquid. So there you have it. So that's the problem Aristotle is trying to solve. We'll get to this later, hopefully, because I have a few quotes. But the stuff people today are the physicists who are reflecting on like laws of the conservation of energy, or laws of motion, or the conservation of momentum, or laws of entropy. So we'll get there. So Aristotle, in looking at all this, and what's wonderful about Aristotle is in his physics, he describes what came before him. He's a great source for what people thought before him. And then he sifts through that and concludes that there are 3 principles of change, and they reside in things, in natures, in a substance. One is privation. Privation, in this context, means someone who's not musical becomes musical. In this example, I use a banana that's green and is in potency to becoming ripe, but it has a privation at the moment. That's the basis for the action that's going to happen. Next is form. It's the actual property or perfection of the thing that's about to change from what it is to what it will be. So we go from not knowing French to learning French. I have a new form. I have a new perfection. I have a new actuality, namely the ability to speak French. The banana becomes ripe. It goes from green to yellow. So the dynamics of change are occurring due to privation and form. Matter, for Aristotle, is this enduring substrate that is in potential to receive the new actuality, the new form. Matter and privation are closely related because the privation exists in some sense in the material substrate, but it's perfected by the form of learning French, the banana becoming ripe, whatever example you want to use. And so there is a subject that underlies the dynamics of change, of this transition from not having the ability to play an instrument to having an ability to play an instrument, is this motion of change, of being in one spot and another. Location will be a category of substance. Substances move in different locations. What's moving? That's the question to what is moving is substance as a subject. And so properties inhere in a substance. This is how Aristotle resolves the dilemma of stuff and things, of change is an illusion to change is all there is for Heraclitus or Democritus. Just the different assembly of atomic or or really indivisible pieces. So there's a sense of being and non-being in this portion of Aristotle. The non-being is I'm in potency to receiving a new perfection, the ability to speak French. I don't speak French today. I'll go to a class or two and I will acquire a form, an actuality of speaking French. The banana sits on my kitchen counter. It's green, too soon. Can't put it in my Wheaties just yet. Skim milk. I wait for the banana to become ripe. Is the banana annihilated? This is also one of the arguments. When things change, substances can change too. There is substantial change, but there's still a material substrate that's subject of those substantial changes. A living person dies is an example of the form of being human, which is our nature, leaving that body. The human being no longer is there. It's a corpse that's decomposing. So form confers actuality, nature, essence to matter. And it can do it through properties where the subject doesn't change. I learned French doesn't mean I become a Frenchman, happily. I'm just kidding. Becoming musical doesn't turn me into a tuba. It's a property of me. This sounds common sense and fundamental, but it's not taught, even though it's the basis for the scientific enterprise, along with logic. So there are real powers, as I mentioned here, in the banana. There are real powers in you to acquire language and musicality and to travel. These are all properties of you. To be a certain height, to have a certain color eye, and so on. There has to be a subject that persists. And this is the genius of Aristotle, is he noticed that the subject is not annihilated when it undergoes change. And so the ideas of potency, potentials, are real. They may not exist, but there's a real potency in any nature to achieve certain ends. We'll keep rolling. But before, just so you might be thinking, well, Charles, how does this really connect to physics today? Let me read you from a work by Richard Feynman, who was the famous, really part of the post-World War II generation of great physicists in the 20th century. You know, came after the generation of Einstein and the other big names in physics. Worked on the atomic bomb, too, as a young man. But he wrote The Essentials of Physics, called 6 Easy Pieces. And you might be asking, well, this things thing that you're talking about, how does this show up in physics? How does Greek thought today actually reappear in physics? And why is Aristotle's solution so relevant today? It shows up in the conservation of energy. Let me read a quote from his lecture on the conservation of energy. Quote, "There is a fact, or if you wish, a law, governing all natural phenomena that are known to date. There is no known exception to this law. It is exact so far as we know. The law is called the conservation of energy. It states that there is a certain quantity which we call energy that does not change in the manifold changes which nature undergoes. That is a most abstract idea because it is a mathematical principle. It says that there is a numerical quantity which does not change when something happens. It is not a description of a mechanism or anything concrete. It is just a strange fact that we can calculate some number, and when we finish watching nature go through her tricks and calculate the number again, it is the same." That position, and again, he was a very famous Caltech theoretical physicist, very well known, tends toward a monism, which is another word for Parmenides' position that being is really one at the end of the day. And part of the reason why physicists, especially the very intelligent ones, make these insights is because they're thinking along the same lines as the Greeks. And coming to Parmenides, again, was another huge figure in philosophy. But because they lack this idea of potency and act, matter and form and substance, they don't know what to do with this, so there's a natural tendency to monism, which means one thing. All of reality is one thing. Nature goes through its tricks. Very Eastern thought, by the way. So again, the relevancy of this should be more clear. And another quote from Albert Einstein wrote with a colleague a work in the late 30s that was then revised again and published along the same lines. And he's talking about matter and fields. We have two realities, matter and fields, which is another way of saying the two are related, because as E equals mc squared is really about the convertibility of energy and matter. From the relativity theory, we know that matter represents vast stores of energy and that energy represents matter. We cannot in this way distinguish qualitatively between matter and field, since the distinction between mass and energy is not a qualitative one. Whoa. But if this is the case, then the difference between matter and field is quantitative rather than qualitative. By far the greatest part of energy is concentrated in matter, but the field surrounding the particle also represents energy, though in an incomparably smaller quantity. We could therefore say matter is where the concentration of energy is great, field where the concentration of energy is small. But if this is the case, there is no real difference between matter and field, just a qualitative one. So you see where this is going, and this is only accelerated among theoretical physicists. So the position of Parmenides is back. You thought he was just an old Greek from 3,000 years ago or so, 2,500 years ago. These positions are back. And Aristotle's synthesis of the pre-socratics is relevant. And by the way, these positions Aristotle has taken have never really been refuted. They've just been ignored. This is the last heavyweight slide. So hopefully we can hang in all together. But as we were going here and reviewing substance, I was going to tell a joke, but it was too long to tell. So, but substance and accidents, they're sometimes referred to as accidents or properties of a thing, account for our experience of change. And again, I'm introducing these concepts more than all the arguments Aristotle makes, just so you have an awareness of it. A substance is that which exists in itself and not in another as a subject. An apple. And you've heard the expression per se. That means in itself. An accident is that which exists in another and not in itself, like the color of the apple. Color is a property of the apple. So that's the core distinction to take away. Substances are not just ways of speaking. There are natural kinds in nature that are substances. You're a substance. Anything with a nature, typically it's anything for Aristotle that grows, has nutrition, and reproduces. So it's largely an organic discussion of substance, though there are other places in the text of Aristotle where he talks about inorganic substances. And modern commentators would begin to talk about subatomic particles perhaps as substances. But for Aristotle, he has in mind organic primarily. He wrote some 35 treatises on biology. So he was every bit as much a scientist as a philosopher in his time. The other thing I will say is substance confers real unity on the thing and powers, potencies. So a dog does not have a real potency to learn French. A human being does. Neither one of them may know French. But the human being has a potential to learn French that the dog doesn't have. And we can distinguish substances. We can distinguish a tree from a rabbit, from a human being, from a chemical compound like H2O. They have different natures. Why? Because they have different powers. Aristotle in the Physics and Metaphysics will then delineate the four causes that are in nature observing substances. We've talked about matter as that which the nature is made of, the stuff. Form confers actuality. Essence, the definition, the nature of the composite unity of matter and form. And it is a real composite. Aristotle is not a dualist. You'll hear that a lot on lectures on YouTube. He's a substance dualist. No, he's not. He simply observes that substances are composed of matter and form. The dualistic thing comes later, and it's being read back, like from Descartes, read back into Aristotle. He would say, what do you mean by a dualist? But what we note in substances as well is that they need an explanation for their existence, for their being. They didn't just pop out of the sky somehow. And this is the role of efficient causality, the act by which, either in the order of properties, we receive a new form, such as the French teacher is the efficient cause of me learning French. He activates a potency in me. Air and humidity and temperature are the efficient causes of that banana turning ripe. It has the potency within it, but it has to be acted on. This is why we freeze things, to take away those influences of decay. So efficient causality is responsible for the being, the activation of the form in matter. And the effect truly depends, really truly, on the cause. It's not just a matter of speaking, which is what your mainline political theory is, modern physics. There are no causes. There's just ways of describing things. There's no human nature. It's just a way of describing you. But there's nothing inherent. There are reasons why people talk that way, and it's really the last one. The final cause that Aristotle and Aquinas develop is, what are the goals that are inherent in human nature or any nature that it tends toward? Its purpose. Telos is Greek for target, end, purpose. All natures have goals and purposes, which final causality is very provocative of intelligence, because goal-directed behavior is the hallmark of intelligence. When you're hot and you start to perspire, you perspire because your body needs to cool down. When your body's temperature goes down again, you stop perspiring. That's goal-directed behavior. When the earthworm is burrowing and making its hole, and it makes it long enough, it stops. So we see goal-directed behavior even in non-rational things. It's the hallmark of rationality, for sure. Planning, means and ends, that's a good definition of being human. But when we see it in inanimate things, things that are non-rational, that's provocative of saying there's goal-directed behavior in nature which points to an intelligence. Your heart starts beating faster when you're running because your body is consuming more energy, needs more oxygen, the lungs have to get moving, and you start breathing heavy. When you stop running, I then collapse, of course, but when you stop running, you get your breath back. The body reacts to a equilibrium state that it has, goal-directed activity at the non-rational level. So there you have it. This is the core infrastructure of the philosophy of nature. That there are substances with properties that have real natures, essences, and that there is causality in nature, real causality in the form of material cause, formal cause, final causality, efficient causality. Let's see then how physics walked away from this. Let me do a quick time check. Okay. I will move to Plan B, so don't worry. But let's get through this piece because it's very interesting to quote from Newton, who understood this. But with the rise of the 17th century mathematical sciences, substance was ignored, denied, as was formal and final causality. These vertical causes, I'll call them that because if you talk about ends in nature being suggestive of intelligence that's outside of nature, that's a vertical cause. That 17th century physicists didn't like that idea. And they didn't like formal causality either because it's the basis for final causality. A distinct nature feels like it was created with a purpose in mind. So formal causality and final causality were kicked off the bus. In time, and Descartes even talked about that, he said, how has Aristotle's notion of substance produced anything in the area of optics, which is, you go to the eye doctor today, you're using some of the methods that Descartes and others, like Newton, described. And so we move from philosophy being the queen of the sciences to the mathematical sciences dethroning philosophy. So science became this isolated enterprise and started making metaphysical claims. Now, no one can deny the progress that the natural sciences have provided for us over the last 400 plus years and the technologies that come from that. And all of that has bred more and more confidence in the scientific method, for sure. But it doesn't make it a good metaphysic or philosophy of nature. But the great separation began between metaphysics and science. And anything that didn't fit mathematical physical description had what Wolfgang Smith called a logical limbo. What do we do with self? What do we do with free will? What do we do with soul? Can't observe soul. How much does soul weigh? Not fillet of soul. S-O-U-L, soul. It's an odd question because we know it doesn't weigh. All these things started being associated with a medieval irrational past in culture. So here's what Wolfgang Smith, quoting from his book Cosmos and Transcendence. Wolfgang actually, he's passed away now, but had a PhD in mathematics, worked for various defense contractors putting satellites into orbit, and then got much more interested in philosophy. And here's what he wrote in Cosmos and Transcendence. Quote, the bifurcation postulate is tantamount to the identification of the so-called physical universe, the world as conceived by the physicist, with the real world per se. Through the device of relegating all else, all that does not fit this conception, to an ontological limbo, situated outside the world of objectively existent things. The postulate thus eliminates at one stroke precisely those aspects of the world which prove to be recalcitrant to mathematical description. All elements, that is, which cannot be reduced to extension and number. This leaves an inherently mathematical universe, the very thing which a science based upon measurement and calculation could hope to master. In other words, it leaves what we have called the physical universe not as a mere abstraction or a useful model, but as the objective reality itself. Right or wrong, let it be said at once that this reduction of the world to the categories of physics is not a scientific discovery, as many believe, but a metaphysical assumption that has been built into the theory from the outset. Interesting comment, but exactly what we've been talking about when we talk about science cutting itself away from metaphysics. Let's look at how another heavyweight in the history of science talked about this, believe it or not. His famous work, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Note the title, by the way. The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It laid the foundation for what we would call classical mechanics, the studies of the laws of motion, Newton's laws that are still taught, by the way, in textbooks in physics. He worked out, his key laws, the formula for gravity, co-inventor with Leibniz of calculus. And though his ultimate theories were replaced by Einstein's general and special theories of relativity, he's nevertheless still taught today. But Newton understood what he was doing. He was giving a description of gravity, of how it works mathematically, not an explanation of the being or existence of gravity. So let's read a quote or two. I shall therefore, from the Principia, the principles of natural philosophy, I shall therefore at present go on to treat of the motion of bodies attracting each other, considering the centripetal forces as attractions, though perhaps in a physical strictness they may more truly be called impulses. But these propositions are to be considered as purely mathematical, and therefore laying all aside physical considerations, I make use of a familiar way of speaking to make myself the more easily understood by a mathematical reader. Note the distinction he's making there. He's not giving a total explanation of motion, and he knew he wasn't. Today, that wouldn't be the case. A physicist would say, I'm giving you the most fundamental explanation of motion there is. Continuing in the Principia, hitherto we have explained the phenomenon of the heavens and of our sea by the power of gravity, but have not yet assigned a cause of this power. Cause? This is certain that it must proceed from a cause, but hitherto I have not been able to discover the cause of these properties of gravity from phenomenon, and I frame no hypotheses. Interesting. He is still making room for philosophy and metaphysics and theology and God. And he thought, I'm able to discover the laws of nature in other parts of the work and in other letters he wrote and describe them in math because they come from the mind of God. That's why they're discoverable. And this, I frame no hypotheses, just as a side note, you might remember when Napoleon asked Laplace, where is God in your theories? Because Laplace was another big contributor to physics. He says, I have no need of that hypothesis. He was kind of repurposing Newton's famous quote here, which is today used by modern physicists to make fun of metaphysics when its entire context is Newton making room for metaphysics. Such is the state of liberal arts education in our culture today. So coming around again then, why is it that causality points to the transcendent? Because this is a program on how we get back to God, how we get back to the transcendent. Why is it that Aristotle and Aquinas' ideas of causality point to the transcendent, And modern physics doesn't, by its own method as practiced today. Well, transcend means to climb over, to surpass a limit. To transcend nature is to appeal to something outside of nature, which is what philosophy and metaphysics do, based upon what I call the complex of causality we see in events, in things, whether it's in the laboratory or our everyday lives. As I mentioned, causality is explanatory of its effect. The effect depends really, truly on the cause. Hot soup, to be hot, depends really, truly on the fire. It's not mere description, not mere association. Mathematical descriptions really are just relating one thing to another with an equal sign and some proportionality of constants, with very sophisticated mathematics, for sure. And all of that can be true, and there's no issue with that from a metaphysical point of view. But mathematical descriptions and equalities never raise the question of causality as Newton understood. They are relating one thing to another. And I give some examples here. Force equals mass times acceleration. That's relating force, something being exerted, on a mass times acceleration. Newton's law of gravity here. As Newton said, this force equals, it's the famous inverse square law. You know, the two masses, the product of them divided by their distance squared times a constant equals the force of gravity. And the bigger the mass, the bigger the force. Great. That's a wonderful, true, to some extent, description of the law of gravity and how it relates masses and forces. It's not an account of causality. Where does gravity come? What causes gravity? What causes matter? It's a description. It's a relating to of different quantities. Insightful, fantastic, predictive. We still use Newton's laws of motions to put satellites up in the air to this day. But as I put it, the mortal sin of scientism, naturalism, atheistic physics, is to think that mathematical descriptions, proportions of entities to each other, is a causal account. It is not. It does not explain the being of these entities, and the scientific method is not suited to even do so. And you know what? People like Sean Carroll, again, another famous physicist and a great teacher, has a big podcast called Mindscape, listened to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, listen to him, lots of young people, makes the same argument. And what happens is physics starts to recline into, we're just providing descriptions which can change. We're not giving an ultimate account because there's no such thing as an ultimate account. We're just giving descriptions. So it's almost as if we can touch on maybe the crisis that physics is in today in terms of searching for the theory of everything. We won't necessarily have to do that, but it's searching for a theory of everything today because it's unhappy with how to reconcile quantum mechanics with Einstein's special and general relativity. That's a big deal today in physics because they have no fundamental account of reality. I am going to pivot because we're out of time, but I encourage you to read the next 4, 5, 6 pages on quantum mechanics as giving another example of Aristotle's notions of substance, cause, and form and material causality. But I will quickly quote from one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, Werner Heisenberg. And then we will sum up and talk about implications. But Werner Heisenberg is one of the pioneers of quantum theory. And in a book he wrote in the 60s called Physics and Philosophy, his quotes as follows: "Actually, the experiments have shown the complete mutability of matter." And what he means by that briefly, the big paradox of quantum mechanics is the wave-particle duality. If you shine a light through a barrier that has two slits in it, it shows up as a wave pattern on the other side. It's not what you would expect. So I'm not going to spend any time on this, but this is the wave pattern. If you shine a light through two slits, that's my golf game, by the way. So the golfer on the left is what we'd expect in classic physics. If I'm hitting golf balls against a wall, which has two openings in it, you see a lot of balls on the ground, by the way, because I'd miss it. And then you'd see two bars that resemble the slits, right? That's the classical model. That's not what happens. When you shine light through two slits, you get this wave pattern on the right. That's the dilemma. How on earth? And it's described, we see this in swimming pools and ponds. This is the mathematical, it's a probability of, the wave is a probability curve. I'm not going to spend time on this. I will. But the measurement, if you put two measuring devices at the slits, that wave function collapses. And this has been verified thousands and thousands. It's the most verified theory in the history of physics. So when we choose to measure the wave, the left side is when we don't measure. We've talked about that. It creates a wave pattern. The right side is what happens when we put detectors at the slits. It collapses and it behaves like a particle. That's what Heisenberg is talking about. Okay, I kind of did talk about it. But there's more there that I didn't cover that you'd actually enjoy reading. Actually, the experiments have shown the complete mutability of matter. All the elementary particles can, at sufficiently high energies, be transmuted into other particles, or they can simply be created from kinetic energy and can be annihilated into energy, for instance, radiation. Therefore, we have here actually the final proof for the unity of matter. This wave-particle duality has created this paradox of what is an electron, what is light, and is it something fundamental like energy or a field or matter? And that's what he's getting at. All of the elementary particles are made of the same substance. Hello. Which we may call energy or universal matter. They are just different forms in which matter can appear. Now here's the one that warms my heart, from Werner. If we compare the situation with the Aristotelian concepts of matter and form, we can say that the matter of Aristotle, which is mere potential, should be compared to our concept of energy, which gets into actuality by means of form, by means of the measurement. The measurement, the detector at the double slit, is imparting information, form, to indeterminate matter of the wave, which was that probability, which gets actuality by means of form when the elementary particle is created against the back detector screen. Isn't that beautiful? So the matter-form concepts of Aristotle that describe nature really truly are showing up again in quantum mechanics. So a photon travels as a wave, but interacts and emits and is absorbed as a particle. And that is an actualization of its position or its speed against that detection screen. So Heisenberg, because his father taught classics at the university, exposed him to Greek philosophy, and he's one of the few modern-day physicists, though there are others, who understand that quantum mechanics poses this dilemma to physics, but is simply an example of what Aristotle had been talking about. and doesn't pose any dilemmas to philosophy. Okay, let's sum up. This is just more on what I just said. But quantum mechanics is an interesting example of the self-imposed arbitrary limits of scientism to give an account of causality in nature. And scientism left to itself lacks the conceptual resources, sometimes called wisdom, of first causes, and so can't give an account of this because it has no concepts of matter, form, substance. Scientism today, as practiced in the university, has traits of religious fundamentalism. It assumes induction, that the past will be like the future. It's simply asserted. Or the idea of nature being rational with repeatable laws. This is an idea that came from the Greeks and elevated by Christianity, that there is a rational God that created the universe, and therefore there are laws in the universe that the human mind can discover, which is what Newton believed as well. But now we get to the more on-the-ground consequences. In culture today, as a result of this dominant narrative taking hold, is the void of transcendence, the rejection of causes beyond matter, the whole rejection of causality in the first place. All physics can provide is a perpetual deferral of an ultimate explanation. What is happening is human autonomy replaces transcendence. That's all that's left, is me, myself, and I. The willing self, the choosing self. Because physics as practiced today and taught kills in the crib any quest for the transcendent or for God among young students. What's left is a universe that's cold and subject to some level of mathematical description. Is rah-rah. I mean, so what's the whole energizing idea there for a young person? Zero-sum choice is what's left. And we see it in chapter and verse. Choice is the only real thing. How I shape my life project is the only thing that's real for me, my truth, and so on. And in a Marxist paradigm, antagonism, whether it's the antagonism of race, class, the alternative sexualities, whatever it is, when the universe is cold and purposeless, as Marx understood, you need antagonism to get the engine going again, to create a narrative for the godless. And worse still, if there's no human nature, no human dignity, no transcendent purposes, let alone no image of God, then the human person is reduced to how are you functioning? Do you belong to the right tribe? And history is full of what happens when you're not in the club. We're seeing it today, whether it's in Africa, something like 100,000 Christians have been killed in Africa in the last 10 years by different groups, but the same religion of Islam. We see it in the anti-Semitic goings on today in the Middle East and in this country. We had 2 world wars in the 20th century that killed tens of millions of people. We had the famines and the mass starvations of the Ukrainians under Stalin and Lenin, the hundreds of millions, 100 million at least, killed by Mao in China. What do you think their philosophy of human dignity was? Do you think it was something from Christianity, or was it something more from physics as practiced today? So we're kind of skating on thin ice the longer this goes. and our sensibilities around the dignity of being human are also at risk. And what follows is, at some point, that you're not in the right group. It's certainly the case for people under the age of 9 months, or those who either by choice or by decision of the state, because they're no longer useful, or they're too old, or they have a terminal disease, they're unplugged. Maybe it was in their will, maybe it wasn't. If you're in Europe, certain parts of Northern Europe, you can be unplugged without any legal protection. So this isn't just Greek philosophy and the consequences of being irrational. Being irrational has consequences politically, ethically, spiritually, personally. You know, if it's up to aesthetics and intuitions, as I put here, about who lives and who dies, that's a very dangerous thing to rely on. If you don't fit the aesthetic, if you don't fit the appearance, if you're not functioning the way we want you to, or if you don't have the right consciousness, you don't think the right things. So these are all the consequences of this. So the way forward is to confidently, last slide, confidently say the natural sciences actually properly practiced lead directly to metaphysics. We're not in a closed cage universe. We're in an open universe that's transcendent, full, enchanted, pointing to, poetic, to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Some of the most beautiful things are in nature. Some tremendous things are works of art. The universe is a moral play. It's a theater of character making. We do have free will. There is such a thing as virtue and vice. And as we'll cover more thoroughly in Class 3, the universe to exist, not to be merely described, requires a transphysical cause. And in Class 4, we will talk about you and me. You're not reducible to mere matter. You, in fact, were made for the infinite, with a mind and heart. Made for the infinite, You are a composite of body and soul, matter and form. And as the psalmist says, man whom you have made a little less than the angels is the pinnacle of the created universe in his grandeur, being created in the image and likeness of God. And in Class 5, we will get to, and all along a person stands before us. The author of it all, who has left his signature, his mark, in the fabric of the universe. Because in the end, I love Greek philosophy, but you ultimately can't love a theory. You can't love quantum mechanics. You can only love a person. And this person has revealed himself first through nature and what he has created, and then in his Son who he sent to us, to tell us about his inner life and to save us in redemption. So that will be Class 5. So I spent a lot of time talking. Any comments or questions at this phase besides asking for water? Yes. The question is how does the distinction of matter and form and substance coexist with just our ideas of seeing things in nature that are consists of parts, even at the molecular and subatomic level? And it's a good question that Aristotle deals with when he's talking about how substance confers a unity on the entity. And for organic substances like a fish, it's the ability to reproduce, nutrition, and growth. They mature and then they die. A subatomic particle has none of those properties, though obviously the organs of a fish make use of the molecular level in the fish. No question about that. But The part of the materialist conceit is by breaking things down into its parts, I'll know what's most fundamental. Actually, that's to destroy the painting. The fish is got its own unity, its own purposes that transcend just these parts. There is a painting in the Art Institute by Seurat, the famous pointillist of, I think it's like a scene of the picnic on the riverbank. And what's unique about it is you can walk up really close to the painting and see the individual points. But you'd miss the painting if you're 1 foot away. When you walk back maybe 30, 40 feet, you see the painting. It's right there in the entrance. You go left, it's right there. It's the showpiece of the entire Art Institute. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you. You see the painting, it has its natural unity now. If I'm up this close to, that purple splotch, that doesn't tell me anything about the painting, let alone the purpose of the painting, let alone who made it. So that's the distinction Aristotle makes between whole and part, because he has a conversation on how the parts relate to the whole, but how the whole confers a unity on the parts. Another analogy would be H2O. Hydrogen by itself and oxygen by themselves don't resemble necessarily H2O as water. You heat water, it has steam, but you see how H2O as a molecule has properties and a unity that hydrogen and oxygen don't explain. Next question. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, in the discussion of causality, if we go back in time, cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, do we get to an original cause, which is the argument for the existence of God apart from divine revelation of sacred scripture and sacred tradition? And the answer is yes. This was very suggestive to the Greeks and even to theologians who said apart from divine revelation, we can reason to the existence of a first cause, which is God. And even Vatican I in 1870 said, it is a dogma of our faith that natural reason without divine revelation can demonstrate the existence of God as a first cause. So it's part of our faith that we believe some people, maybe not us, can make an argument and reason to the existence of God through natural reason alone. Yes. Other questions? Yes, Wendy. So the question is, what about the immanence of God, God residing in our souls, and us having experiences of God? All perfectly valid, and you're right to raise that. Tonight we were speaking from the standpoint of someone who has no experience of God, or rejects God, doesn't believe He exists, and so is on the fence or is on the other side of the fence as an atheist. And he would just say those are pious feelings that people who need those crutches to get through life talk about. So what I was trying to do tonight is just show, no, scientifically, philosophically, we can point to the existence of things outside of matter, which we'll do more definitively in class 3, that don't require divine revelation. That was really our goal for tonight. Obviously, the experience of God in one's life is another way people come to God. They're not going to read Aristotle or Aquinas. I'm not saying this is the only way to know God. This is more of a scientific discussion about the limits of the scientific method and how metaphysics and philosophy elevate, without revelation, the ideas of the transcendent and the existence of God. So the question, which I think everyone heard, but just in case, does this materialist, agnostic, atheistic overlay bleed into the other disciplines of psychology, psychiatry, even in the medical field when issues of medical ethics come up? And the answer is it does, at least implicitly. And the couple of cases I'm aware of are of people who go to a counselor for marriage problems. If that counselor is an atheist, you will get different advice than if they're Catholic or if they have a spiritual dimension to their existence. the advice will be somewhat different. Or if someone has different forms of some mental illnesses of some kind or another, the types of therapies that can be recommended, some might be, in fact, immoral to do. And so, depending on the person's background, they will recommend certain things. For example, they might say to you, if you ask, I go to church, but I'm not getting anything out of it, the counselor, who might be agnostic, might say, well, why don't you try another church? Or, what is it in the Catholic faith that bothers you? And someone will say X, Y, and Z, and then they'll say, well, that seems to be what's bothering you. So why don't you just set those beliefs aside then? So, yes, it does bleed into the other disciplines, for sure. It's not just a theoretical discussion we're having here. So the comment is, this separation is disingenuous because all of these disciplines started in one shape or form with religion. But the counter-argument to that is, well, you could say that about anything. So religion preceded, in many ways, Judeo-Christianity for sure in the West, preceded everything that's happened. So just because, we used to bleed people too when they, so why are we attached to that? Why don't we continue bleeding people when they have an infection? So you can't just argue from temporal priorness to we must continue this, otherwise we'd all still have VCRs and cassette tapes. So you have to get into the philosophy of it. And you could start with, well, psychology is from a Greek word meaning psyche, which means soul. So your very discipline starts with the study of the soul, which is an immaterial, non-physical thing. But you could start there. But you can't just say because it was previous, we have to carry it forward. So, good. Well, thanks everybody. Next week we will cover now those causal things in modern physics that point to a beginning of the universe and a first cause of the universe. So that's class 3. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.